Jake Morrison sat in the third row of the massive lecture hall and tried to keep his breathing steady. Around him, dozens of alien students filled the curved seats that rose up like steps toward the back of the room. Each student looked different from the next. Some had scales that shimmered under the bright lights. Others had fur or skin that changed colors as they moved. A few had extra arms or legs or eyes in places that made Jake feel dizzy if he looked too long, but none of them looked human except for Jake, and even he did not look human right now. The holographic disguise wrapped around his body like invisible clothing. It made his skin appear blue-gray and gave him the tall, thin appearance of a Chilean student. His brown hair was hidden under the illusion of a smooth, elongated head. His human eyes were covered by the fake image of large, dark Kellyan eyes that blinked sideways instead of up and down. The disguise had cost him 6 months of his life to perfect. He had studied recordings of Kellyan movements, learned their language, and practiced their customs until he could fool even their own people. At least, he hoped he could. Today would be the real test. Professor Zethkalar entered the lecture hall through a door at the bottom of the room. Jake had seen many aliens during his time at Kepler University, but the professor still made him uncomfortable. The Vorthak alien stood nearly 8 feet tall on 4 legs that looked like tree branches. His body was covered in what looked like living crystal that caught the light and threw rainbow colors across the walls. 4 arms moved independently as he arranged his teaching materials on the floating desk platform. His head held 4 eyes that could look in different directions at the same time. The professor's voice filled the room as he began to speak. Jake's translation device, hidden inside what looked like a normal Kellyan study pad, converted the clicks and whistles into words he could understand. Welcome, students, to Advanced Xenobiology. Today we begin our study of one of the most interesting failures in galactic evolution. The humans of Sol 3, also known as Earth, represent everything that can go wrong when a species develops intelligence but lacks the wisdom to use it properly. Jake felt his jaw muscles tighten, but he forced his face to remain calm. Around him, students leaned forward with interest. A few took notes on their various devices. Others simply watched with the kind of fascination people showed when looking at something strange and amusing. The professor waved one of his arms and a 3-dimensional image appeared in the air above the students. It showed Earth as seen from space, blue and white and beautiful. But the way Professor Zethkalar spoke about it made it sound like something diseased. Notice the single-star system. Most successful species develop in systems with multiple suns, which provides them with the complex energy patterns needed for advanced thinking. Humans grew up with only one sun, which explains their simple, linear thought processes. Jake wanted to laugh or maybe throw something. He knew that Earth's single sun was actually one of the reasons human civilization had developed so successfully. It provided steady, predictable energy that allowed life to flourish in ways that would be impossible in a multi-star system. But he stayed quiet and pretended to take notes like the other students. Their technology remains embarrassingly primitive, the professor continued. The image changed to show what Jake recognized as very old pictures of human rockets. The professor had somehow obtained images from at least 20 years ago, back when humans were still using chemical fuels for everything. They still rely on burning substances to push themselves through space. Compare this to even the most basic Confederation vessel, which uses quantum field manipulation for propulsion. A student near the front raised what looked like a tentacle. Jake had learned this was the Aquarian way of asking permission to speak. Professor, how do they manage to survive with such limited technology? Professor Zethkalar made a sound that the translator converted into laughter. They barely do survive. Their population is constantly fighting wars over basic resources. They cannot even agree on how to govern their single planet, much less expand to others. While most species achieve unity within decades of developing spaceflight, humans have spent over a century arguing about everything from energy sources to territory boundaries. Jake bit the inside of his cheek to keep from responding. It was true that humans argued and fought, but the professor made it sound like mindless violence. He did not understand that human disagreement often led to innovation and progress. Some of humanity's greatest advances had come from the need to solve problems that different groups approached in different ways. The holographic display changed again. Now it showed human cities, but again the images were old and carefully chosen. Jake could see pictures of pollution and overcrowding, but nothing of the clean energy systems and green architecture that had become common in recent years. Their cities demonstrate their complete inability to plan for the future. They build without regard for their environment, poison their own air and water, and crowd together in ways that breed disease and social unrest. Any species that fouls its own nest so thoroughly clearly lacks the intelligence for interstellar expansion. More students asked questions, and each answer made Jake more frustrated. The professor spoke about humans as if they were animals that had accidentally learned to use tools. He described human emotions as primitive impulses that interfered with rational thought. He claimed that human art and music were simple noise compared to the sophisticated cultural expressions of advanced species. But what bothered Jake most was how much the other students believed everything they heard. They nodded along with each ridiculous claim. They took notes as if they were learning important scientific facts. Some even asked questions that showed they thought humans might be dangerous in the way that wild animals were dangerous, unpredictable, and violent, but ultimately harmless to advanced civilizations. As the lecture continued, Jake began to understand why he had been sent here. Earth's government had suspected that the Galactic Confederation misunderstood humanity, but they had not realized how complete that misunderstanding was. The aliens did not just think humans were primitive. They thought humans were a failed species that would never amount to anything important. Professor Zethkalar wrapped up the first lecture by assigning reading materials about human psychology and sociology. Jake made note of every source the professor mentioned. He would need to read them all to understand exactly what the Confederation thought they knew about his people. As the students began to file out of the lecture hall, Jake stayed in his seat and watched Professor Zethkalar pack up his materials. Tomorrow there would be another lecture, and Jake would be here to listen and learn, but not in the way the professor expected. The next morning, Jake arrived at the lecture hall early and chose a seat closer to the front. He had spent most of the night reading the materials Professor Zethkalar had assigned, and what he found made his stomach turn. Every single source contained information about humans that was either completely wrong or so outdated it might as well have been fiction. The textbook described human military forces as if they were still using World War II equipment. The psychological profiles made humans sound like barely controlled animals driven by fear and anger. The sociological studies focused only on human conflicts and completely ignored the cooperative achievements that had allowed the species to reach space in the first place. Professor Zethkalar entered the room precisely on time, his 4 crystal-covered arms carrying data tablets and projection devices. The alien students around Jake settled into their seats with the eager attention of people about to hear something entertaining. Today we examine human military capabilities, or rather their lack thereof, the professor began. His 4 eyes swept across the room as he spoke. This is perhaps the most telling indicator of their evolutionary limitations. The air above the students filled with images of human weapons and vehicles. But again, everything Jake saw was years out of date. The professor showed pictures of old tanks and jets and ships that belonged in museums, not military bases. Note: the crude kinetic weapons, Professor Zethkalar said, pointing at an image of what looked like a rifle from Jake's grandfather's time. They still use chemical explosions to throw pieces of metal at their enemies. Compare this to standard Confederation pulse weapons, which use directed energy to disrupt molecular bonds. A student with green scales and 6 arms raised one of her hands. Professor, what about their nuclear weapons? Some reports suggest they have developed atomic explosives. The professor's mandibles clicked in what Jake had learned was Vorthic amusement. Indeed, they have managed to split atoms and release energy. But their largest nuclear devices produce less power than a standard mining charge used in asteroid operations. More importantly, they seem incapable of using this technology constructively. Instead of atomic engines or matter converters, they built bombs and pointed them at each other. Jake gripped his fake study pad tighter than he should have. The professor was technically correct about early human nuclear weapons, but he had no idea about the fusion reactors that now powered most of Earth's cities or the antimatter research facilities hidden in the outer solar system. The images changed to show human spacecraft. Once again, everything was decades old. Jake saw pictures of the International Space Station and early Mars rovers, but nothing of the sleek vessels currently being built in the shipyards beyond Neptune. Their space technology remains laughably primitive, the professor continued. Their largest vessels can barely carry a few hundred individuals, and only for short distances within their own solar system. They have never successfully established a permanent colony beyond their homeworld, despite having the technology for basic spaceflight for over a century. This time, a student who looked like a walking plant raised what might have been a branch. Professor, why have they not expanded beyond their world? Most species begin interstellar colonization within decades of achieving spaceflight. Professor Zethkalar's 4 eyes focused on different parts of the room as he considered the question. Several factors contribute to their failure. First, they lack the genetic adaptability needed for different planetary environments. Most successful species can modify their biology for new worlds, but humans seem locked into their current physical form. Jake almost snorted out loud. The professor clearly had no idea about the genetic modification research happening in Earth's laboratories, or the experimental colonies where humans had already begun adapting to different gravity and atmospheric conditions. Second, the professor continued, they lack the social cohesion necessary for large-scale colonization efforts. Their governments cannot cooperate long enough to plan projects that span decades or centuries. They start ambitious programs and then abandon them when political leadership changes. Finally, and most importantly, they are afraid of the unknown. Humans evolved as prey animals on a dangerous world, and this has left them with psychological limitations that prevent true exploration. They send robots instead of living beings to investigate new worlds because they are too frightened to go themselves. The lecture continued with increasingly ridiculous claims about human psychology and behavior. Professor Zethkalar described human emotions as primitive chemical reactions that interfered with logical thinking. He claimed that human art and literature were simple expressions of basic survival instincts rather than complex cultural achievements, but the worst part was when he began discussing human intelligence itself. Brain scans of human specimens show neural activity patterns consistent with species in early stages of sentience development. Their brains are large relative to their body size, but most of that space is devoted to controlling basic motor functions and processing sensory input. The regions responsible for abstract thought and long-term planning are significantly smaller than those found in truly intelligent species. Jake knew this was completely false. Human brains were actually more complex than most alien species, with neural networks that could process multiple types of information simultaneously. The professor was either working from bad data or deliberately misrepresenting the facts. Perhaps most telling, Professor Zethkalar said, humans appear to lack the ability to think beyond their immediate needs. While advanced species can plan and execute projects spanning thousands of years, humans rarely think more than a few generations ahead. This short-term thinking explains their environmental problems and their inability to achieve lasting peace. Student near Jake raised what looked like a claw. Professor, if humans are so limited, why do some reports describe them as unpredictable or dangerous? The professor paused for a moment before answering. Unpredictability is not the same as intelligence. A wild animal can be unpredictable because it acts on instinct rather than reason. Humans are dangerous in the same way that any cornered animal is dangerous, but this danger comes from desperation, not strength. Their so-called military victories throughout history have relied on luck, superior numbers, or simple brutality rather than strategic thinking. They win battles by throwing resources at problems until something works, not by developing elegant solutions. Jake thought about the human military strategists he knew. People who could analyze complex situations and develop plans that took hundreds of variables into account. The professor's description made humans sound like mindless berserkers, when in reality human military doctrine emphasized intelligence gathering, careful planning, and efficient use of resources. As the lecture neared its end, Professor Zethkalar made one final claim that made Jake's blood boil. In conclusion, humans represent an evolutionary dead end. They have reached the maximum level of development possible for their species, and that level is insufficient for membership in galactic civilization. They are destined to remain isolated on their single world until they eventually destroy themselves, through war, environmental damage, or simple inability to adapt to changing conditions. This is not a tragedy, the professor added. It is simply natural selection at work on a cosmic scale. The galaxy will be better served by focusing our attention and resources on species with genuine potential for advancement. The students around Jake nodded and took notes as if they had just heard profound wisdom. Some even looked relieved, as if they had been worried about humans becoming a threat and were now reassured that such concerns were groundless. As the lecture ended and students began filing out, Jake remained in his seat. He watched Professor Zethkalar pack up his materials and wondered how the alien would react if he knew that one of the primitive humans he had just insulted was sitting less than 20 feet away, having infiltrated the most secure educational facility in this sector of space. Tomorrow, Jake decided it was time to start asking some questions of his own. Jake spent the break between lectures walking through the university's botanical gardens. The alien plants around him came in colors and shapes that Earth had never produced, but somehow they reminded him of home. Maybe it was because growing things always looked hopeful, no matter what planet they came from. He had made a decision during the morning's lecture. Sitting quietly and recording everything was important, but it was not enough. He needed to understand not just what the aliens believed about humans, but why they believed it. And the only way to do that was to start challenging their assumptions. When the afternoon session began, Jake took a seat in the front row. Professor Zethkalar noticed the change and nodded at him with what might have been approval. The professor probably thought his Kellyan exchange student was showing proper academic enthusiasm. Today we will examine human social structures and their implications for species development, the professor announced as students settled into their seats. This topic is particularly relevant for understanding why humans have failed to achieve the unity necessary for interstellar expansion. The holographic display showed images of human cities and governments from around Earth, but once again, the professor had chosen examples that painted the worst possible picture. Jake saw footage of protests and conflicts, images of poverty and inequality, scenes of political arguments and social unrest. Observe how humans organize themselves into competing groups based on arbitrary distinctions, Professor Zethkalar said, gesturing at the images. They divide themselves by geography, ancestry, belief systems, and economic status. Rather than working together as a single species, they waste enormous amounts of energy on internal competition. Jake raised his hand using the Kellyan gesture. He had practiced. When the professor acknowledged him, he spoke in the careful accent he had spent months learning. Professor, I have been reading the assigned materials about human social behavior, and I noticed something interesting. Many of the sources focus on conflict and competition, but they mention very little about human cooperation. Are there any studies of how humans work together? Professor Zethkalar's four eyes focused on Jake with interest. An excellent question, Mr. Kuthneri. Human cooperation does exist, but it operates on a very small scale. They can work together in groups of a few dozen individuals, sometimes up to a few hundred, but they appear incapable of organizing effective cooperation beyond that level. Jake nodded as if this made sense to him. But Professor, what about their space program? The materials mention that humans have sent expeditions to other planets in their solar system. Surely that would require cooperation between large numbers of people? True, but examine the history of their space efforts, the professor replied. Their early space program was not motivated by scientific curiosity or species advancement. It was driven by military competition between rival human governments. They reached their own moon primarily to prove superiority over their enemies, not because they had any genuine desire to explore space. A student with purple fur and large ears spoke up. What happened to their space program after they reached the moon? Professor Zethkalar made his clicking sound of amusement. They essentially abandoned it. Once the military competition ended, they lost interest in space exploration. This demonstrates their inability to maintain long-term projects that do not offer immediate benefits. Most of their current space activities involve sending robotic probes because they lack the courage and organization needed for crewed missions. Jake felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice calm. Professor, I wonder if we might be missing something important about human adaptability. The materials show that humans have established communities in many different environments, on their own planet from extremely cold regions to very hot deserts. Does this suggest they might be more adaptable than we think? The question caused a stir among the other students. Several turned to look at Jake with curiosity. Professor, Zethkalar's crystalline skin seemed to shift color slightly, which Jake had learned indicated increased attention or possible concern. Mr. Kathmiri, you seem quite interested in defending human capabilities, the professor said slowly. While it is true that humans have spread across their planet's surface, this adaptation is entirely technological rather than biological. They survive in harsh environments by building artificial shelters and wearing protective clothing. This is not true adaptation, Jake leaned forward slightly. But Professor, is technological adaptation not a form of intelligence? Most species either adapt biologically to their environment or they modify their environment to suit their biology. Humans seem to do both. They change their environment through technology while also using technology to survive in unchanged environments. Furthermore, Jake continued, feeling bolder, their apparent inability to agree on things might actually be a strength rather than a weakness. If everyone thinks the same way, how can new solutions be discovered? Perhaps human disagreement leads to innovation. The lecture hall had grown very quiet. Professor Zethkalar was staring at Jake with all four eyes, and several students were looking back and forth between them as if watching a fascinating competition. Mr. Kathmiri, the professor said carefully, you appear to have developed some unusual theories about human development. Perhaps you would care to share your sources with the class? Jake realized he was walking into dangerous territory, but he was committed now. I've been conducting independent research for my thesis on cognitive diversity across species. I am particularly interested in species that might be underestimated by conventional analysis methods. And what has this research revealed? Professor Zethkalar asked. Jake took a deep breath. I think we might need to reconsider our assumptions about what intelligence looks like. Human brains process information differently than most species we study. They excel at pattern recognition, creative problem solving, and rapid adaptation to new situations. These might be different forms of intelligence rather than signs of primitive thinking. A student with scales and tentacles raised an appendage. But if humans are intelligent, why have they not joined galactic civilization? Jake had prepared for this question. Perhaps they have not been invited. Or perhaps they are being more cautious than we realize. If I discovered that a galaxy full of advanced species considered my people to be primitive failures, I might choose to stay hidden until I better understood the situation. Professor Zethkalar's color shifted again, becoming noticeably darker. Mr. Kathmiri, these are very interesting theories, but they seem to be based more on speculation than evidence. The scientific consensus about human limitations is supported by decades of research and observation. But what if the research is based on incomplete or outdated information? Jake asked. Most of the materials we have been studying show human technology and social structures from many years ago. What if humans have been developing faster than we realize? The professor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone that Jake had not heard before. It sounded almost like suspicion. "Mr. Kathmiri, you seem remarkably well informed about human development patterns for someone studying them as a theoretical exercise. Your questions suggest a level of familiarity with human psychology that goes beyond academic research." Jake felt the attention of every student in the room focused on him. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I believe in thorough research, Professor. If we are going to make judgments about an entire species, should we not examine all available evidence?" "Indeed we should," Professor Zethkalar replied. "Perhaps you would be willing to present your alternative theories to the class tomorrow. I would be very interested to hear your evidence for human advancement." Jake nodded, knowing he had just committed himself to something that could expose his true identity. "I would be honored to share my research with the class." As the lecture ended and students began filing out, Jake remained seated. He watched Professor Zethkalar pack up his materials, and he noticed that the alien kept glancing in his direction. Tomorrow would be the real test of his disguise and his mission, but tonight he had some urgent messages to send to Earth. Jake spent the entire night preparing for what might be his last day at Kepler University. He had sent encrypted messages back to Earth, informing his handlers about the situation and requesting permission for what he planned to do. The response came back quickly and surprised him with its simplicity. "Use your best judgment, we trust you." The next morning, Jake entered the lecture hall to find it more crowded than usual. Word had apparently spread about the exchange student who was challenging Professor Zethkalar's theories about humans. Students from other classes had come to watch what promised to be an interesting academic debate, Professor Zethkalar noticed. The larger audience and seemed pleased by the attention. He arranged his materials on the floating platform with extra care and checked his recording equipment twice. Jake realized the professor saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise to a wider audience. "Class, today we have the unusual privilege of hearing alternative theories about human development from our Kellyan exchange student, Mr. Kathmiri," the professor announced. "Before we begin, however, I think it would be appropriate to review the established scientific consensus." The professor activated his holographic display and began running through images Jake had seen many times before. Old human technology, outdated social structures, carefully selected examples of conflict and environmental damage. As we have established in previous lectures, humans represent a species that has reached its evolutionary plateau without achieving the breakthrough necessary for interstellar civilization, Professor Zethkalar said. They remain trapped on their homeworld by their own limitations, primitive technology, social discord, and psychological barriers that prevent true advancement. Jake stood up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him, dozens of alien students turned to watch with eager anticipation. Some had even brought recording devices to capture what they expected to be an entertaining academic discussion. "Professor, with your permission, I would like to present some information that might change how we understand human capabilities," Jake said, using the formal Kellyan speech patterns he had practiced. "Please proceed," the professor said, gesturing toward the front of the room with two of his arms. Jake walked down to the presentation area, feeling the weight of every gaze in the amphitheater. When he reached the front, he turned to face the audience and took a deep breath. "Thank you for this opportunity," he began. "I have spent considerable time studying humans, and I believe our current understanding of their species contains some significant errors." He activated his own projection device, one of the most advanced pieces of technology he had brought with him. The holographic display that appeared above the students showed crisp, clear images that were obviously much more recent than anything Professor Zethkalar had been using. "First, let me address the question of human technology," Jake said. The display showed sleek spacecraft that looked nothing like the primitive rockets from the professor's lectures. These images were taken within the last 6 months. As you can see, human space technology has advanced considerably beyond what our textbooks suggest. A murmur ran through the audience. Several students leaned forward to get a better look at the images. Professor Zethkalar's four eyes were focused intently on the display, and his crystalline skin had shifted to a deep blue color that Jake interpreted as confusion or concern. "Where did you obtain these images?" the professor asked sharply. "Independent research," Jake replied calmly. "The question we should be asking is why our official sources are so outdated." He changed the display to show human cities that gleamed with clean energy and green architecture. Advanced transportation systems moved people efficiently through urban areas that had clearly been designed for both functionality and beauty. Human environmental technology has also advanced far beyond what our studies indicate, Jake continued. They have developed fusion power, atmospheric processors, and ecological restoration systems that rival anything in Confederation space. The audience was completely silent now. Even Professor Zethkalar had stopped moving, his forearms frozen in positions of apparent shock. Jake knew he was approaching the point of no return, but he pressed on. "More importantly, we need to reconsider human psychology and social organization. The professor has described humans as unable to cooperate on large scales, but recent evidence suggests otherwise." The display now showed what looked like massive construction projects in space. Orbital platforms and shipyards that clearly required coordination between millions of people to build and operate. "These facilities exist in the outer regions of the human solar system," Jake said. "They represent the largest construction projects in known space, requiring unprecedented levels of cooperation and long-term planning." Professor Zethkalar found his voice. "Mr. Kethmiri, these images are clearly fabricated. Human technology is not capable of such achievements." "Where exactly did you claim to obtain this information?" Jake looked around the room at the alien faces staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination to growing alarm. He made his decision. "Professor, I think there is something you and your students need to know about my research." "Methods?" he said quietly. He reached up and deactivated his holographic disguise. The change happened instantly. His false Kellian appearance dissolved like smoke, revealing his human features. Brown hair, pale skin, brown eyes that blinked up and down instead of sideways. A face that belonged to no known species in Confederation space. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Students gasped and jumped back in their seats. Several screamed. Others activated emergency communication devices or reached for what might have been weapons. Professor Zethkalar made a sound like breaking glass and stumbled backward, nearly falling off his platform. "My name is Jake Morrison," he said, speaking clearly so his words would carry over the noise. "I am a xenobiologist from Earth, and I have been attending your lectures for 3 weeks." The panic in the room was almost overwhelming. Students were trying to leave their seats, but the aisles were too crowded for quick movement. Some were shouting in languages his translator could not identify. Others seemed frozen in place, staring at him as if he might explode at any moment. "Professor Zethkalar," Jake continued, raising his voice to be heard over the chaos, "you have been teaching your students that humans are primitive and isolated. I am here to tell you that every one of those assumptions is wrong." He pulled a small device from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "This is a quantum communication array. Right now, it is connected to 12 human vessels positioned at the edge of your solar system." The noise in the room cut off as if someone had thrown a switch. Professor Zethkalar's four eyes were locked on the device in Jake's hand. 12 ships? The professor whispered. Jake nodded. "We call it the First Contact Fleet. They have been waiting out there for 3 weeks while I gathered intelligence about how the Confederation views humanity. What I learned is that your information about my species is at least 20 years out of date." He activated the quantum communicator, and Commander Lisa Hayes' voice filled the lecture hall through the translation system. "This is Commander Hayes of the Earth Expeditionary Fleet. Professor Zethkalar, we have been monitoring your lectures with great interest. We think it is time for a more accurate discussion of human capabilities." Professor Zethkalar collapsed into a chair that had been designed for his four-legged anatomy. His crystalline skin had gone completely transparent, which Jake suspected indicated shock or fear. You see, Professor, Jake said gently, while you have been teaching that humans are too primitive and divided to pose any threat, we have actually been working together more effectively than ever before. The possibility of encountering hostile alien civilizations has a way of focusing the mind and encouraging cooperation. Security forces were finally pushing through the doors at the top of the amphitheater, but Jake continued speaking calmly. We are not here to conquer or threaten anyone. We are here to correct some dangerous misconceptions and to begin a proper introduction between our species and yours. But first, Professor, I think you have some new lecture material to prepare. The security forces that burst through the doors of the lecture hall stopped dead when they saw Jake standing calmly at the front of the room. These were not campus guards, but actual Confederation military personnel, armed with weapons that hummed with deadly energy. Their leader, a massive creature that looked like it was made of living metal, raised what Jake assumed was some kind of scanner. "Unknown species detected," the security chief announced in a voice that sounded like grinding gears. "Readings do not match any known biological signatures in Confederation databases." Jake held his hands up in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. "My name is Jake Morrison. I am human. I am unarmed, and I surrender myself to your custody." Professor Zethkalar managed to stand up on his four shaking legs. "Commander Turgath, this individual has been attending my classes under false identity for weeks. He claims to represent a species we believe to be primitive and isolated." The security chief's scanner made beeping sounds as it examined Jake. "From head to toe?" "Sir, the creature appears to be carrying advanced technology. The device in its hand is emitting quantum signatures that suggest capabilities beyond current Confederation standards." Jake slowly held up his communicator where everyone could see it. "This device is connected to the human fleet waiting at the edge of your solar system. Would you like to speak with them directly?" Commander Turgath looked at Professor Zethkalar, who nodded shakily. The security chief made a gesture, and his soldiers lowered their weapons slightly. "Proceed," Commander Turgath said. Jake activated the communicator again. Commander Hayes' voice filled the room, calm and professional despite the tense situation. "This is Commander Lisa Hayes, Earth Expeditionary Fleet. To whom am I speaking?" "Commander Turgath, Kepler University Security. You claim to represent the human species of Sol 3? "Correct. We have been observing your educational institutions to better understand how the Galactic Confederation perceives humanity. What we have learned concerns us greatly." Professor Zethkalar stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Commander Hayes, our information indicates that your species lacks the technology for interstellar travel. How is your presence here possible?" There was a pause before Commander Hayes responded. "Professor, your information about human capabilities appears to be severely outdated. We achieved faster-than-light travel 8 years ago. We have been observing Confederation space for the past 3 years, deciding whether to make contact." The students in the amphitheater had grown completely silent. Many were recording everything on their devices, probably realizing they were witnessing a historic moment. 3 years? Commander Turgath asked. "Your ships have been in our space for 3 years undetected?" "Not just our ships, Commander," Hayes replied. "We currently have observation posts in 7 different Confederation systems. We have been learning your languages, studying your cultures, and assessing whether your civilizations pose a threat to Earth." Jake could see the implications of this revelation hitting the aliens around him. If humans could place observation posts throughout Confederation space without being detected, then everything they thought they knew about human capabilities was wrong. Professor Zethkalar made a sound like cracking crystal. "But our intelligence reports, our scientific studies, all our data indicates that humans are technologically primitive." "Professor," Jake said gently, "your data is based on what we wanted you to see. For the past 20 years, Earth has maintained a carefully crafted image of a struggling, divided species barely capable of basic spaceflight. We needed time to understand what we were dealing with before revealing our true capabilities." Commander Hayes' voice continued the explanation. We discovered evidence of Confederation monitoring stations in our outer solar system 15 years ago. Rather than making immediate contact, Earth's leadership decided to conduct our own intelligence gathering operation. The result, Jake added, is that we now know far more about your civilizations than you know about ours. We have studied your technology, your military capabilities, your political structures, and your educational systems. We know which species are peaceful and which are aggressive. We know which governments are stable and which are not. A student with bright purple skin and 6 eyes raised a trembling appendage. Are you saying humans have been spying on us? Jake nodded. Yes, but not for conquest. We needed to understand whether the Galactic Confederation represented an opportunity for peaceful contact or a threat that required defensive preparation. Commander Turgith stepped closer, his metal body reflecting the lights of the room. And what conclusion did you reach? That depends, Commander Hayes's voice answered through the communicator, on how you respond to this first contact situation. We have prepared for multiple scenarios. Professor Zethkalar suddenly seemed to understand, something that terrified him. The ships at the edge of our solar system, how many humans do they carry? Each vessel has a crew of 800, Commander Hayes replied. But Professor, you should understand that these are not our largest ships. They are scouts in diplomacy. Vessels, our main fleet remains in human space, ready to respond if needed. The implications hit everyone in the room at the same time. If 12 scout ships carried nearly 10,000 humans, and these were the small vessels, then humanity's true military capability was far beyond anything the Confederation had imagined. Jake could see fear spreading across the alien faces around him, but he also saw something else, respect. For the first time since arriving at Kepler University, he was looking at aliens who understood that humanity was not a species to be dismissed or underestimated. We do not want war, Jake said clearly. We want understanding. For too long, your people have seen humans as primitive failures destined for extinction. This misconception is dangerous for both our species. Commander Turgath's scanner continued beeping as it analyzed Jake's biology. Sir, detailed scans confirm this individual's claims. His neural activity patterns and physical capabilities are far more advanced than our files indicate for his species. Professor Zethkalar sank back into his chair, his forearms hanging limply at his sides. 20 years of research, decades of accepted scientific consensus, all wrong. Not wrong, Professor, Jake said gently. Incomplete. Your scientists studied the evidence they were given, but they were not given the complete picture. How could they reach accurate conclusions based on false data? One of the students, a tall creature with silver fur, found the courage to speak. What happens now? Will more humans come? Commander Hayes answered from the communicator. That depends on how this first contact proceeds. We have prepared 3 different response scenarios based on the Confederation's reaction to our presence. Commander. Turgath's metal head turned toward the device. What are these scenarios? Peaceful integration, where human representatives join Confederation institutions and begin formal diplomatic relations, Commander Hayes explained. Cautious coexistence, where we maintain separate territories but establish trade and communication. Protocols. Or defensive isolation, where we withdraw from Confederation space and prepare for the possibility of future conflict. The lecture hall remained completely silent as the aliens processed this information. Jake could see the wheels turning in their minds as they realized that humanity's response to first contact would depend entirely on how they were treated in the next few hours and days. Professor Zethkalar slowly stood up again, his crystalline skin shifting through several colors before settling on a deep blue that Jake interpreted as thoughtfulness. Mr. Morrison, in your weeks of attending my lectures, what did you learn about Confederation attitudes toward your species? Jake considered his answer carefully. I learned that most of your people see humans as a failed species that will never amount to anything significant. I learned that your military planners do not consider us a threat worth preparing for. I learned that your scientists base their conclusions on outdated and deliberately misleading information. But I also learned, he continued, that many of your people are curious, intelligent, and capable of changing their minds when presented with new evidence. Professor, you have spent your career studying species development. You understand better than anyone how dangerous it can be to underestimate an unknown civilization. The professor's 4 eyes focused on Jake with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. What would you have us do? Exactly what you have been doing, Jake replied. Study, learn, and teach, but this time use accurate information. Send your best scientists to meet with our representatives. Ask questions, conduct experiments, gather real data about human capabilities and intentions. Commander Hayes's voice added support to Jake's words. The Confederation has protocols for integrating new species into galactic civilization. We are willing to follow those protocols, but only if they are applied fairly and without prejudice. Based on outdated assumptions. Commander Turgeth lowered his weapon completely and addressed his communicator. Commander Hayes, I will need to report this contact to Confederation leadership immediately. What are your intentions while we await their response? We will remain at the edge of your solar system and await diplomatic contact, Commander Hayes. Replied. Mr. Morrison will remain available to answer questions.